So today I'll be talking about outer space cybersecurity. I wonder if I could start with a show of hands. How many of you would say you already work in space cybersecurity? Okay, a few of you, that's great. Well, this session is definitely for you. I'll be talking about how to avoid being taken by surprise in your line of work. But the session is definitely for everyone else too, who wants to understand why outer space is the next big thing and growth area for cybersecurity. Let me start with the standard disclaimer that my remarks today are my own only and not of any of the organizations I'm affiliated with. This includes Cal Poly, the National Space Council, its Users Advisory Group, NASA, and other organizations. Here is a sneak peek at our agenda today. So I'll be doing the main event in two parts. First, I'll talk about why space cyber attacks are becoming an urgent problem. And then I'll talk about how to anticipate and generate novel scenarios in space cybersecurity. And then I'll wrap it all up with what all this means for you. Oh, by the way, so this talk draws from a project I'm leading. It's the first project funded by the National Science Foundation on outer space cybersecurity. And I'll say a little bit more about that project towards the end of this talk. Before we get to the main event, let me back up a bit and give you some background on why outer space security is important now, even though we've been in outer space since the 1960s, right? To start that story, let me first explain why outer space itself is important, because that's not obvious to a lot of people. It's one of those, if it's out of sight, it's out of mind situations, okay? So the short story is that we use or benefit from space services every day. You're already familiar with GPS for positioning and navigation. You probably already use it just to get to this conference, right? The streets of San Francisco are super tricky. But GPS isn't just for ordinary car drivers. They're super crucial for airplanes and ships, right? There's no road signs in the skies or in the open oceans. GPS is important for what else? Managing and coordinating fleets of trucks that transport food and other stuff to your local stores every day, right? Satellites are important for precision timing. Some sectors crucially depend on that, like financial transactions, financial services, computer communications. Speaking of communications, I hope you're familiar with satellite internet and satellite phone services, right? So those aren't important only for people who live in these far-off remote locations and don't have other options, but they're an important lifeline for people who are in natural disasters or emergencies. For instance, if you find yourself in a war zone. Satellites are eye in the sky. They provide a unique vantage point on the Earth. And these Earth observations are important for lots of things. Predicting the weather, farmers use it to improve the productivity of their farms. People use it to manage land and waterways. What else? We use it to monitor the environment and animals. We could even use Earth observations to track people. We could study migration patterns of refugees, or we could look for military troop buildups along the border and military movements. So you can already tell, outer space is a crucial domain for lots of things: security, industry, economics, and a lot more. And if your work doesn't take you into space infrastructure today, it may very well do that in the future, because space business is really starting to boom. Okay, so space is important, but why worry about space security right now? I'll explain this more in the next few slides. The basic story is that we're in a new space race, and our orbits have not been more congested or contested than they have been now. And nation states around the world are gearing up to compete for space resources and research sites on the moon and other places. And private actors, commercial ventures are joining the mix now. They're actually adding to the chaos a bit, because international space law doesn't really regulate these business ventures in outer space. And all this is driven by technology, which, as you know, is hackable. To explain this a bit, I know you can't read everything in this slide, so I'll talk to it very quickly. Since around the year 2012, just about every year, we're setting new launch records for the number of objects we're launching into outer space. So from the 1960s to 2012, that number's been more or less stable. It's around 130 a year. But starting with 2012, After a couple of years, that number doubled, then doubled again, then tripled. So right now, we're launching about 2,600 objects into space a year. Most of that is from the United States, but other countries are catching up too. And it used to be that only nation states could afford to play in outer space, but right now, space is very much driven by the private sector, right? Again, I know you can't read everything in this graph. The big point here is that more than half of the world's satellites are owned by one company, SpaceX. And SpaceX is owned by one person, Elon Musk. And that by itself raises special challenges for governance and ethics. And so SpaceX owns more satellites than all of the world's governments put together, right? Which sounds crazy. And this just only happened recently in the last 10 years or so. So lots of people now think that we're headed into the next gold rush. And here's an example why they might think that. So take this asteroid 16 Psyche. It orbits the sun in between Mars and Jupiter. It's as bigger than the Mediterranean island of Cyprus, and it's so full of iron and nickel that's estimated to be worth $10 quintillion. That's 10 with 18 zeros behind it. None of us here has ever conceived a number that big. So in comparison, the value of the entire world's economy is only an adorable $105 trillion. That's 105 with 12 zeros behind it, right? So orders of magnitude smaller than the value of this one dumb asteroid. Anyway, NASA sent a probe up there in October. It's going to take 6 years to get there. Here's another example. The major space powers are racing right now to set up camp on the south pole of the moon, the dark side of the moon. So as it goes, and the reason why is that there's special scientific value on the south pole of the moon, but there is nothing in space law that prevents one of us from setting up camp directly next to the other one. And considering the countries we're talking about, US, Russia, China, India, that's an inherently dangerous situation. We're talking about fierce competitors and sometimes adversaries, right? So this is a big gap in space law, but there are efforts underway to close up that gap. So for instance, the United States with our Artemis Accords, we're trying to set up safety zones around research sites, right? So that prevents interference and possible conflicts. But the Artemis Accords are not legally binding international law. They're only bilateral agreements with other countries. So Russia and China doesn't have to respect our safety zones. India does because they're a signatory. And this drive into space is being propelled by technologies. So if you look at the two animations on the left, these are reusable rocket boosters developed by SpaceX. Okay, now the entire launch vehicle isn't reusable yet, but these first stage boosters already do a lot of work. They can save 60% off the price of every launch. That's huge. The middle animation is a constellation of satellites. That one is managed by Iridium. Iridium is a satellite internet company. And it's basically a floating mesh network around the globe that beams down connectivity to us. On the right is a futuristic concept of a spacecraft with robot claws, and it could clean up space debris. There are plans to clean up space debris with other things like netting, lasers, and even prototype tractor beams. The reason I mention this is, as you know, all technologies are hackable. AI and robotics have a special role in outer space. They do everything from, say, analyze and enhance images in Earth observation and astronomy data. They could help identify new exoplanets that we might want to investigate. It could autonomously create missions around that. It could also control lots of aspects of spacecraft operations, navigation, docking, diagnostics, maintenance, resource allocations, a lot more than that. We like to use robots too for the jobs we call the 3Ds, jobs that are dull, dirty, and dangerous. And mining and construction definitely fits in that bill, and there are lots of plans for mining and construction in outer space. And again, all these technologies are hackable. Okay, so with that background, let's get to the main event. So this is part one, why space cyber attacks are likely and dangerous. And it wasn't exactly a cyber 9/11, it wasn't a cyber Pearl Harbor, but it's definitely a serious wake-up call. So as you know, a couple of years ago, Russia invaded Ukraine. But 1 hour before it invaded, it had reportedly hacked into the equipment of a satellite internet company called Viasat. Viasat is an American company. And the goal, presumably, is to cut off communications in Ukraine, cause confusion, and an effective coordinated response. Before long, Starlink came to the rescue, provided equipment for its satellite internet services. And again, Russians tried to hack into that. But they haven't been successful yet, as far as we know. And I'll explain a little bit later why that might be. So anyway, this was our first true space war where both sides were using space assets in their operations. Right? I mean, we've been using space assets for decades, since the Gulf War in 1990, but it's only been one-sided until this event a couple of years ago. And around this time, Russia really raised the stakes. They declared that if anyone hacks into their satellites, they're going to take that as an act of war, a declaration of war, or casus belli. This is a dramatic escalation from previous policy, and it really signals to you how important, how essential satellites are to modern militaries today. So with that wake-up call, it's really important to understand the factors that are driving the rise of space cyber attacks, and I'll explain each of these in the next slides. And this, again, draws from work on our NSF project that's underway. First reason is space is just far away and very hard to access. None of us here, I'm guessing, have ever been in outer space. In fact, 99.999% of the 8 billion people in the world have never been in outer space. Our only interaction with space has been digital, through our phones, websites, working with space data. That's about it. So it stands to reason that if anyone wants to hack something up there, they also would have to do it digitally or through cyber means. And once a space system is up in orbit, they're really hard to update. It's not like we can just go up there and swap out a server anytime we want, right? So we got to make do with basically what we send up there for the entire life of the spacecraft. And that makes them very attractive targets for hackers if they're 10, 20 years behind in cybersecurity. And this cyber insecurity only gets worse over time. We got satellites up there that are still working from the 60s and 70s before cybersecurity was even a thing. And right now, we're still launching satellites without any cybersecurity, which sounds crazy, right? I mean, these are mostly CubeSats. CubeSats are small Rubik's Cube-sized satellites. They're really popular with, say, universities because they're small and cheap to launch. But because they're small, they don't have a lot of room for onboard components for cybersecurity, and universities typically don't have the budget for that anyway. A second driver of space cyber attacks has to do with space debris, or at least indirectly. So what's space debris? Space debris is all the junk we leave up there, the dead satellites, lost equipment and tools, spent rocket boosters, broken solar panels, that kind of stuff. But the thing is, space debris isn't just floating peacefully up there in outer space, it's actually zipping around the globe at incredible rates, 20 to 25,000 miles per hour. Again, a huge number to comprehend, but let me put it in other words, that comes out to 6 to 9 miles a second. At that speed, you could move across the entire length of San Francisco in 1 second. So think for a second how fast that is. Anyone having a collision with something moving at that speed is going to have a very bad day. They're going to experience an incredibly energetic accident. And at that speed, even something as tiny as a fleck of paint can destroy an entire spacecraft, which it almost has in the past. So we got to track all these things, right? We got to make sure we know where all the space debris is so we're not launching a rocket into a debris field. Or we want to know if a satellite is on a crash course with a piece of space debris and we got to make an emergency maneuver. So of the 40,000 things we're tracking or so, about 20% of them are working satellites. The rest is literal junk. But it gets worse. There's actually 1 million more bits of space debris that we're not even tracking because they're small. They're 1 to 10 centimeters. But even those bits can be devastating and could destroy entire spacecrafts. Oh, it gets worse than that. There's 130 million more bits of space debris that we can't even see. We can't even track with the technology if we wanted to. And those are smaller than 1 centimeter. Again, all of them are incredibly dangerous. And the danger isn't just to individual spacecraft. There's a planetary scale risk here too, called the Kessler syndrome. The Kessler syndrome is basically this tipping point where there's so much space debris in our orbits that they start crashing together in this uncontrollable chain reaction of collisions. And it's unpredictable until ultimately the entire globe is littered with space debris. We're surrounded by a cocoon, a minefield of space debris. And that's going to make it very dangerous for anyone to launch anything to orbit if it has to go through this minefield. It could put an end to all space programs around the world, right? So it's a worst case scenario. What does this have to do with cybersecurity? Well, space debris is a great deterrent against kinetic conflicts in outer space, because any kinetic conflict, any shoot 'em up battle in outer space is going to create space debris and brings us closer down this path of the Kessler syndrome. In a kinetic war in outer space, there are no winners. Everyone's a loser because space debris can threaten all of our space assets equally. It doesn't care what the nationality is of the thing in front of it. So even if we were a kinetic battle in outer space, it would be a Pyrrhic victory at best. A Pyrrhic victory is where you technically won the battle or war, but you suffered such great losses that it feels like losing, which makes you wonder why you were involved in the first place, right? The third reason has to do with the complexity of space systems. I mean, they're really systems of systems. If we think about the space environment alone, like we're not even talking about the technology, but the space ecosystem alone, it's complex and probably unlike anything you've ever seen. There are many different segments you got to secure. So there's a launch segment that includes the space launch complexes, R&D facilities. There's a ground segment that contains mission control. There's the space segment that contains everything up there in orbit and in outer space. There's the user segments, the people using GPS, satellite internet, phone, space data. And then there's the communication links. There's the uplink into space, there's a downlink into Earth, there's a crosslink where satellites can talk to each other. And these complex, so that's the ecosystem, but the technology itself is also complex and diverse. We're sending up there satellites of all kinds of shapes and sizes for a whole range of missions. We're sending up space probes, lunar rovers, Martian rovers, space telescopes, spacecraft that's both crewed and uncrewed. If it's crewed, you gotta have life support systems for the humans and animals inside, right? So all this is incredibly complex and typically requires a long supply chain, which is problematic for cybersecurity for integration issues, and different vendors might have different standards for cybersecurity, especially we talk about military versus civilian contractors. Some satellites even use commercial off-the-shelf parts, right? Which, again, sounds crazy for cybersecurity. But the one good thing that space tech has going for it here is that much of it today is new technology. They're novel. They're one-of-a-kind prototypes. And that means they're understudied, and threat actors won't know right away how to break into your system. And this is why Russia has had a hard time hacking into Starlink so far as we know. But this could go the other way too. So if your technology is understudied, that means you don't know where the vulnerabilities are in your system as well. Earlier, I mentioned a legal gap around this idea of safety zones, and there are other gaps too. And legal gaps are contributing factors to cyber attacks, right? So legal gaps can cause, they open up room for confusion, misunderstandings, miscalculations, and that could slip into conflict. And again, any conflicts in outer space are likely to be cyber conflicts. And the basic problem here is space law is old. It's developed in the 60s and 70s and didn't even anticipate any of the modern problems we're facing today. Right? Space law doesn't say anything about space debris, cyber attacks, rogue startups, and other things. We don't have time to get into this here, but just quickly, even basic key principles in space law are unclear and ambiguous. All space lawyers would agree this, right? So so for instance, what does peaceful use mean? What does interference mean? What is appropriation? Those are still underspecified and vague, and that could open the door for trouble. Yikes. Another reason to expect cyber attacks in outer space is the same reason why we can expect cyber attacks on Earth. They work, right? They have economic and political benefits. So compare this to, say, a military mission where you're putting boots on the ground or you're launching missiles, right? Those will cost millions and millions of dollars. But how much is, say, an email phishing campaign? $30 a month, right? Politically, cyber attacks are less provocative and escalatory because we're not blowing anything up. We're not killing people. That also means we're not getting body bags back home. We're not causing mass casualties anywhere. So it's less provocative that way. And there's lots of plausible deniability around cyber attacks, as you know. Finally, the stakes in outer space are unusually high, so we got to pay special attention to this. I mentioned earlier all the critical services and infrastructure up there, both defense and civilian. Even if something isn't providing a critical service, it could still be a high-profile symbolic target that's attractive to threat actors, like the International Space Station, for instance. And cyber attacks generally don't cause space debris, but they can. So imagine I hacked into a satellite and I bricked it. I just created a huge piece of space debris that could crash into other things and cause more space debris. Or imagine I hack into a critical system of a spacecraft and I cause it to overheat and I overload the batteries. That could cause an explosion that could destroy the spacecraft and create thousands of pieces of space debris immediately. So all this adds up to a pretty powerful case to think that space attacks are going to be likely in the future, if not getting worse, and they're more dangerous than we might think. And as I explained, that we have reason to think that cyber attacks will be the main mode of conflict in outer space, just because the threat of space debris is such a great deterrent for kinetic actions. Okay, so now let's change gear a bit and talk about the work of space cybersecurity, specifically how to generate and anticipate novel scenarios to avoid surprise. If you ever followed along any discussions in space cyber attacks, you might notice that there's only a handful of scenarios that ever get trotted out, and they're usually vague and generic and a bit hand-wavy. So there's usually something about satellite hacking, there's something about signals jamming or spoofing, not exactly cyber, more electronic warfare, but more or less the same thing. And that's about it. But there's so many more possibilities than these two that we really need to consider. So there's a true need for imagining novel scenarios. Hackers are already imaginative, creative, resourceful, and defenders need to be too, just to keep up. This is just the coevolution of hunter and prey in cybersecurity. That's all it is. And you already know that failure to imagine can be catastrophic. And that means failure to understand threat actors, all the different motivations, all the vulnerabilities across a complex system, and a lot more. So we need to anticipate many more of these scenarios to avoid tunnel vision and avoid surprise and plan properly. So from this NSF project that I mentioned, we developed over 100 novel scenarios, and here I'll show you 4 as an example. So this one here, the threat actor is an eco-terrorist who wants to harm the environment. And their goal is to disrupt disaster tracking response to let a serious wildfire continue burning out of control. So imagine there's a wildfire, in Sonoma County, and it's moving north. It wants to trick space systems to show that it's moving south, and that would misdirect emergency responders and fleeing residents. And their plan is to target certain Earth observation satellites, and their method would be through a sensor injection or optical attack. Oops. In the second scenario, the threat actor is a religious cult who wants to do something big and, people to see a religion. And his goal is to spoof a technosignature. A technosignature is digital evidence of ET life, like, they capture a recording of some alien language. And the goal here is to create a global panic. Their target is the James Webb Space Telescope, and their method is to inject false data on the downlink back to Earth. In the next scenario, the threat actor is just a bored teenager who's curious to see if she could hack into a university satellite project, right? And maybe deorbit the satellite. By deorbiting, I mean sending the satellite back down the Earth. The problem with that is that there's an unintended risk. If you deorbit something, you're not careful in it, you're not aware of what you're deorbiting it through, you could cause a collision. It could crash the CubeSat into something on the way down. And the plan here is to target a university CubeSat that has prototype thrusters. It can maneuver. Now, CubeSats don't generally have thrusters because they're so small, but in the last few years, there have been research on how to do that. CubeSats could also be stacked together in different small number of units. And the plan here is to do it with something like an insider attack. Just simply steal her roommate's credentials and inject a bad command in the uplink. And in the last scenario, we have a rogue company who's not afraid to play dirty. And their goal is to sabotage a competitor space hotel to scare away investors and customers. And their plan to do this is to target the life support systems with a supply chain hack. They can do this because they understand the supply chain because they share the same suppliers. Right, so these are only 4 out of more than 100 scenarios we created with a taxonomy we created in the project, which looks like this. We call it a scenario prompt generator. It's something like a choose your own adventure. So you have 5 columns here, or categories, that capture the major elements of a scenario. So the first one, you can't read this for that far, but the first one says threat actors. The second one is about motivations. The third is cyber attack methods. The fourth is about victims and stakeholders. And fifth is about space capabilities affected. And I'll say a little bit more about this in the next slide. But for each category, you have 20 starting variables. And the idea here is to pick a variable from 2 or more columns. There's your prompt to generate a novel scenario. And in this 5 by 20 matrix, there are 4 million unique combinations possible. To say a little bit more about this scenario prompt generator, it's meant to capture the big questions of a scenario: the who, what, where, when, why, and how. So when we talk about threat actors, we want to know who is attacking. When we talk about motivations, why are they attacking? Cyber attack methods, how are they attacking? The victims and stakeholders, that's another who question. Space capabilities affected. That's about what is the effect of the cyber attack or the intended effect. The when and where of a scenario actually depends on the scenario. It's not exactly a variable. So imagine the scenario is about hacking into a Martian colony, right? The when would be not anytime soon, right? Not inside the next 20 years. And the where would naturally be on Mars. So the when and wheres aren't really variables. They're more like dependencies. Anyway, so if you're interested in this, we're on track to release a report this summer, hopefully before July, and it's going to contain all this, everything I talked about today, plus a lot more scenarios. We'll see how many scenarios will actually fit in the final report without making it too fat. But if you're interested in this, keep an eye on our website, spacecybersecurity.org. All right, so let me wrap this all up. Hopefully, I've convinced you that outer space is a critical domain to defend. And for many reasons, we can expect space cyber attacks to be the main mode of conflict in outer space, not least of all which is to avoid more space debris. And in cybersecurity, you already know the threat environment is constantly evolving. So it takes imagination to anticipate the next surprise, right? To get out of your comfort zone around familiar scenarios and start thinking about more of these edge cases or these novel cases. And this means it's essential to understand the who, what, where, when, why, and hows of a scenario. All right, what does this mean for you? This means that cybersecurity is looking like a growth field. And if you're not working in space cybersecurity, you might want to consider learning more about it. And RSA Conference is actually a great place to do it. In Moscone South, where is that? Like that direction. Aerospace Village is running its aerospace sandbox all day today and most of the day tomorrow. Tomorrow, in one floor below us in the morning, there's going to be a panel on space cybersecurity with government experts. So I highly recommend that panel tomorrow in the late morning. If you're already working in space cybersecurity, you can stretch your imagination to go beyond the usual scenarios, and our taxonomy can help you with that. And other groups, MITRE Aerospace Corporation, they have taxonomies as well. If you are a policy type, there's still a role for you here too. You could help to fill in these legal gaps that are contributing factors to conflict. You could help develop policy responses and solutions to these novel scenarios to make sure they don't escalate out of hand. If there's a big takeaway here, it's this. Space conflicts will likely be low level and non-kinetic, more like the movie Hackers, and a lot less like Star Wars. So cybersecurity experts, all of you, are needed on the front lines of this defense. With that, I thank you, and I believe we have time for Q&A. Okay.
Yes, thank you, everybody. The microphones are open if you have any questions.
Quick, open-ended, pretty large question. Cyber resiliency. What needs to be built in? You talked about the effects of a very, very small piece of debris. What sort of requirements should be placed on both government and commercial sector manufacturers to ensure that satellites operate correctly and that they can recover and fight through any sort of attack?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is the big question facing a lot of folks now. One challenge is that satellites typically have limited maneuverability or no maneuverability. So that's something we're looking to improve, to give them more control and maneuverability. Another way is to improve our space situational awareness, or sometimes called space traffic management. So to be able to track more bits of space debris, not just the 30 to 50,000 we're tracking, but the millions more that we really need to. But yeah, I mean, that's a tough problem. So Artemis Accords and other efforts now are thinking about the end of the life of a satellite. They want satellite providers to have a plan to deorbit their satellites before the end of their life, or at least push them up into the graveyard orbit, right, and not contribute more to the space debris. So there are mitigation efforts. There's also active removal efforts, right? I showed you that image of the spacecraft with a claw. But those actually run into serious problems because space trash is owned by somebody. There's no abandonment clause in outer space, right? So we need to solve that problem first in order to actively remove space debris. So huge question, but there's lots of, there's a lot of parallel solutions going on.
Hi, Cal Poly student here, fan.
Yeah.
But I had a question with, is because of kind of the understudy of technology for space, is there more of a push for more research into cybersecurity for proprietary technologies that are put into satellites, or more of a push for new technologies that really haven't been seen before, such that there aren't any new vulnerabilities found during its time up there?
Yeah, I think the situation, I'm not very optimistic about that situation. I mean, the development of spacecraft is very unique. It'll take 10 plus years from conceptualization to launch, right? It takes a long time, and it's hard to keep up on cybersecurity practices across that entire length of time. Oftentimes, when a spacecraft is completed, it's just sitting at a warehouse or assembly facility untouched for months, right? And anything could happen between then. So that's why a lot of times a spacecraft is 10 years behind in cybersecurity at launch time. And once it's up there, it gets worse. I'm sorry, was there a second part to your question?
No, thank you very much.
Hello.
I feel there was, and I don't want to shortchange you, so find me after if there was.
Hello, I'm Rose Stanfill. I'm an aerospace engineering student. And I was curious, how do you, from a cybersecurity perspective, when you're talking to engineers and asking them to incorporate elements of cybersecurity or to make systems that are compatible with cybersecurity, how do you, what requirements or suggestions do you make for them? And then also, as you mentioned, there is a 10 plus year design process for these things that are behind. What are some ways with because we have AI that's going to make that even faster, I'm assuming. How can we bridge that gap as engineers to kind of cut down that distance between the security we have on our spacecraft?
I think I would punt that question to the cybersecurity panel tomorrow with government experts because I'm less of a technical person, more of a policy
Gotcha.
ethics philosopher person. But you reminded me of the last person's question, which is what can we do about this? One thing we can do, there is a push to standardization, right? But that raises its own challenges because if a technology is standardized, commercial off-the-shelf part, then threat actors are really going to understand that system and how to break into that wherever it's found. Other hand, if we make all of our space technologies one-off prototypes, right, security by obscurity, that doesn't seem very sustainable either. I mean, that's got a lot of problems too. So, and that's why I said originally, I'm not terribly optimistic just because the space environment is so unique in how it develops spacecraft and which cuts across a large amount of time, and you have different vendors that you got to work with and integrate together. So I'm afraid I can't really answer the details of the technical questions. I could gesture at general solutions, but again, I would point you to the Aerospace Sandbox in Moscone South, and they might have better insight, as well as the panel here tomorrow.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that at the United States Air Force, we have at the U.S. Air Force Research Laboratory an active Hackasat project that's open to members of the Defense Industrial Base and to academics. As well, our friends at the European Space Agency have an active program as well. So I'd encourage everybody to take a look at both of those.
Yes, absolutely. So I think it's hackasat.com, and they just had their 4th competition last year at DEF CON, and they had some winning teams, I think from Italy. So I think the Air Force, with their Hackasat competition, was really prescient because they started running this more than 4 years ago. And it's only 2 years ago have we seen our first, what I would call the first true space war, where both sides are using space assets in their operations.
Hi, Megan Gates from Security Management Magazine. I had a question going back to your slide looking at satellite ownership in space.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could talk about sort of the ethical concerns related to having two sort of private individuals, Elon Musk and then Jeff Bezos, having such a controlling interest in the ownership of satellites in space.
Yeah, I don't want to say too much, but I could tell you, I could point at some actual events that have already happened, which is, when you have one company, one person owning such a large constellation of satellites, they have a tremendous amount of power and influence in geopolitics. So, for instance, Starlink, again, came to the rescue of Ukraine, but they could have, and they had considered pulling out of Ukraine, right? They're saying, no, this is too hot for us to touch, in which case we would effectively be leaving Ukraine blind and they would just get creamed by Russia. So think about that. One person having that kind of influence over geopolitics, over the fate of a war, the outcome of a war, right? So that itself is troubling. And considering this is the richest person in the universe we're talking about, it's hard to imagine what kind of accountability, what kind of pressures or levers you could pull to steer this person in a more responsible direction in case they start going off the rails. But also I mentioned that international space law doesn't say much about governing private actors. International space law is more about governing nation states. And space law around industry is typically governed by national law, which varies from country to country. SpaceX is also, Elon Musk has interests around the world too. So it's a complicated topic. I think everyone in DoD and NASA understands the wild card they're playing with, but so far it's worked out. And they are a leader in space technology. So keep our fingers crossed.
Hello, Antonio Satlasis from the European Space Agency. Maybe to complement with a couple of things for information purposes, and then I have a question. First of all, the topic of threats for space mission. It's also tackled in the context of standardization bodies like CCSDS, where NASA, the European Space Agency, or other agencies like the Japanese one participate. This is public information, so someone who wants to find information can just find the CCSDS site and download the relevant standards or architecture. There's also space architecture, security architecture. Also, there are some new standards published by NIST on the topic, as well as there's going to be a very brand new standard by ECSS. ECSS is a European standardization body on the topic, so it will be the first, I would say, standard on security, where topics like the ones discussed, how you update spacecraft during the whole life cycle, are tackled there. And my question would be how, what you propose here, and especially from the list you had several steps, and one of them was the how. How does this complement for potentially efforts like Sparta from Aerospace Corporation with the TTPs, or even Space Shield from European Space Agency? Because all these topics about the TTPs, at least, to some extent are tackled there. So how this complement or work together with them? Thank you.
Yeah, so I appreciate those comments and questions. So if I'm understanding them correctly, is the slides not shown anymore? First of all, European Space Agency, ESA, is a great partner to space programs around the world. We work with ESA on the Artemis missions, right? So ESA created the Orion spacecraft, for instance. They do great work. And their website is a tremendous resource too. So if you want to learn about space, I would also recommend visiting ESA's site. You mentioned Sparta taxonomy, right? So that was developed by Aerospace Corporation, Brandon Bailey, I believe. And that's a great, very comprehensive taxonomy, but it's a technical taxonomy, and it's huge. And there are other taxonomies too, MITRE's attack taxonomy, for instance. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We were actually looking at those first to see if we could turn them into something useful, but we decided that we couldn't, because many of the taxonomies were either too technical, and we wanted to appeal to a wider range of stakeholders, policymakers, and other people who weren't technical people, or they're too simple, and they didn't include considerations for space systems like launch segments, ground segments, and other things like that. So there are reasons why we didn't go with other taxonomies, but their taxonomies are complementary to ours. So once you have a scenario prompt, a basic outline of scenario, you could consult these other taxonomies like Sparta, and get into more details in building out the scenario. So I see them as complementary. Do we have time for other questions? I know we need to clear the room before the next session.
Yeah, there is time still if there's any more questions. Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Chris. I'm a cybersecurity advisor, and one of the things, it's just a fascinating area to start thinking about, expanding into for a lot of our traditional cybersecurity models. And I'm wondering, if communication security is such an important element that it would involve things like, making sure there's no lateral movement, lateral communication, leapfrogging between systems. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about communication, and then also on your slide, much earlier you had electromagnetic, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about that too. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so the question's already starting to slip from my mind because it's multi-layered. But I think the communication piece is so critical, right? Because our interaction with space is mostly digital, we need to have that connectivity in order to interact with it, unless you're an astronaut and already in outer space. And as I mentioned, the communication links is so varied too, uplink, downlink, and crosslinks, and all sorts of things. So I think communication is mission critical to any space system. And especially, and it gets tricky when you're talking about spoofing and jamming attacks. A lot of those happen here on Earth. But with these, so for instance, It would be hard to do a man-in-the-middle attack on a downlink of a satellite transmission because there's no middle. The satellite signals basically hit all of our receivers at the same time, right? So there are special considerations there. Your second one was about spectrum, right? Electromagnetic spectrum. And the only thing I want to mention there is that, I mean, it seems like every talk you give about cybersecurity or this, you got to acknowledge that, yes, technically there's a difference between cybersecurity and electromagnetic spectrum attacks, jamming, spoofing, and other directed weapons. However, since they're all non-kinetic, they're all kind of invisible, they're generally lumped into the same kinds of discussions. And I'm still seeing aerospace companies just starting to treat them both in the same category, even though they're technically distinct. There are special considerations for EW, electronic warfare, than cyber warfare. You're right. But I think for the purposes of this, of just building scenarios, that's not a distinction that's not a difference that makes a difference. But you're right, there is a difference there. Did that answer your question at all?
Yes, that answered quite a few things, and I just have a quick follow-up. What about external environment, electromagnetic interference, solar flares?
Oh, natural threats are a big deal in outer space. I mean, just as squirrels might be the major cybersecurity threat here on Earth, natural threats are a main cyber threat in outer space. So there are increased radiation. So if you're storing crypto keys, space radiation could flip a bit from time to time, then all of a sudden your key doesn't work, right? So, and a cyber attack could target some of those systems that are guarding against natural threats, right? So that might be a way the cyber attack could expose a spacecraft somehow to more natural threats, maybe reposition solar panels so they're facing the sun and they burn out, for instance, or there's other ways. I think a creative hacker could help talk you through all that.
If there's no more questions, please, everybody, feel free to complete the survey and have a great rest of your day. Thank you, everybody.